Good evening and welcome to tonight's program of the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm Gloria Duffy, President and CEO of the club and your chair for today. We also welcome our listeners on the radio and the viewers of C-SPAN. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker. I was fortunate to meet our speaker this evening on a trip where she and I traveled as guests of the Department of Defense this past summer around the European theater, looking at the readiness of U.S. forces to fight the global war on terrorism. At the end of our trip in June, during which we whizzed around the globe from place to place, from Bosnia to Azerbaijan to Germany and Spain and an aircraft carrier in the Atlantic, one of our trip mates on the trip gave some joking awards to other participants in the trip. And together, Dr. Kellerman and I received an award for asking the most complicated, multi-part questions of all of the military officials that we were meeting with. Now that I've read Dr. Kellerman's book, Bad Leadership, I see that she has penetrating answers as well as penetrating questions. This really is an excellent book. She begins the book by saying that it looks at the dark side of leadership. It's about the dark side of the human condition. It paints leadership in shades of gray and in black. It doesn't sound like that's an uplifting topic, but in fact, her conclusions are very instructive and will enable us to look for better leadership in our society. Dr. Barbara Kellerman is lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and research director of the Center for Public Leadership. She has served as the director of the Kennedy School Center for Public Leadership as well. Previously, she's held professorships at Fordham, Tufts, Fairleigh Dickinson, George Washington, and Uppsala universities. She was Dean of Graduate Studies at Fairleigh Dickinson and Director of the Center for the Advanced Study of Leadership at the Academy of Leadership of the University of Maryland. She is a true expert on leadership. She graduated with her bachelor's degree from Sarah Lawrence, her MA, MPhil, and PhD degrees in political science from Yale University. She's been the recipient of a Danforth Fellowship and 3 Fulbright Fellowships. At Uppsala University, she held the Fulbright Chair in American Studies. She is a prolific author of 11 books on leadership and related topics, including Reinventing Leadership, Making the Connection Between Politics and Business, and many others. She appears frequently on national news programs, CBS, NBC, PBS, and CNN, and writes for many publications, including, among others, the New York Times. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Barbara Kellerman.
Thank you, Gloria. And Bob, it's good to be working with you as well. All right. Now, those of you who have been around the leadership block a little bit, as I have, must be asking yourselves, why is this woman writing a book about bad leadership? What would we want to know about bad leaders? Well, my answer to you is, why not? I am going to start by making 3 basic points, and the first one relates to the point I just made. This book is to claim for the leadership field the bad side. Those of you who have any familiarity at all with works on leadership know that they are nearly entirely about good leadership. How to be a good leader, how to become a good leader, how to grow a good leader, how to develop a good leader. In fact, the field of leadership studies has become so skewed that I argue that the word leadership now implies, typically, good leadership. I'm taking a course on leadership. That means I'm taking a course on good leadership because I want to learn how to be a good leader. But I'm on a crusade with this book. And my crusade is to suggest to you and the entire reading public that is going to read this book that you cannot learn about good leadership without being willing to look, as Gloria just said, at the dark side. I cannot tell you in a few simple words why it is that my own field, my own colleagues, have been so reluctant to look at the ugliness of leadership. And there is a lot of leadership that is ugly, that is not very pretty. We know that. We wake up in the morning and we see it in our newspapers, we see it on television, we see it on the internet, and yet it has not been addressed. And so this book is to look at the subject of bad leadership, which is every bit as much about the human condition as is good leadership. My second key point: since no one has written about this subject before whole, I decided I wanted to look at the entire universe of bad leadership, lots of different kinds of rotten leaders. And I looked at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases of bad leadership, and I ended up by dividing them into 7 different types. And the heart of my talk in the next few minutes will indeed be about the 7 different types of bad leadership. One other little footnote. I became interested in this subject some years ago when it dawned on me that in a world full of ugliness as well as beauty, there was no literature on bad leadership. I wrote a small essay, called Hitler's Ghost, a manifesto. The word manifesto implies what this kind of talk is about, which is I'm here to make a pitch. I'm here to sell you on the idea that bad leadership, studying bad leadership, matters. But the Hitler's ghost phenomenon I left behind in that I did not want my work to be on the extremes. I wanted to look at bad leadership whole, hence the 7 different types. The web. What is the web all about? One other problem with my field of leadership studies, which I adore beyond all measure, is that it has become excessively leader-centric. There's just one teeny-weeny problem with that. You can't do leadership alone. You need at least one, and I'm sure I could ask you all to say the word out loud, you need at least one follower. So this book is not about bad leaders. You'll notice I didn't call it bad leaders. I called it bad leadership. The word leadership implies leaders and followers interacting. In no case was the bad leader bad alone. He always, or she always, acted with the support of followers. So the web is about 3 strands that intersect in a web. 1, the leader. 2, the followers. And 3, the context in which they were embedded. Clever little mouse. Making meaning of being bad. People would say to me, so what do you mean when you say bad leadership? My favorite story in this regard is when I was some years ago giving a talk on bad leadership, getting into the subject. I gave a talk to a group in New Haven, and I said what I thought was an incredibly simple statement, something about Hitler being a bad leader. No sooner were the words out of my mouth than somebody in the audience actually interrupted me, waving frantically and saying, no, Hitler was a very good leader. He was good in that he was brilliantly effective. Then and there, I understood I better make my use of the word bad clear. So for the sake of the book and the sake of the discussion, bad means either ineffective or unethical, or every now and then it means both. Means and ends. We can't go into this here. It's so complicated. But I will tell you that sometimes a leader and his or her followers have good ends. and rotten means. Sometimes they have just the opposite, and sorting that out is a lot of fun and games. I was going to say, the PowerPoint is not responding as it should. Aha, okay. Success. The 7 different types of bad leadership. Number 1, incompetent. We will go into these in detail. Number 2, rigid leadership. Number 3, intemperate leadership. Number 4, callous leadership. Number 5, corrupt leadership. Number 6, insular leadership. And finally, evil leadership. If somebody can control this PowerPoint, this is not working. I don't know if we can fix this while we're talking, but I will tell you that the first, if we can make the slide go faster, I'll nod to you if you can move the keyboard along. Good, okay. If somebody wants to stay there and just move it up, that would be great. I'll signal to you. The first kind, incompetent leadership. The leader and at least some followers lack the will or skill or both to sustain effective action. With regard to at least one important leadership challenge, they do not create positive change. My first example. Now, in each of the different types, for each of the different types, I provide in the book many examples. But I focus on one, and in this case, a man by the name of Juan Antonio Samaranch. I see some of you nodding heads in the audience. This man was head of the International Olympic Committee for 2 decades. And he presents us immediately with some of the complexities about this because he was in many ways a competent leader. But toward the end of his tenure, for his last 5-10 years in office, by the way, 20 years is a very long time to hang around, but towards the end, in this particular case, he was absolutely oblivious to what was going on around him. He was oblivious to the drugging. He was oblivious in particular to the corruption that tainted the international Olympic movement and taints it to this day. He left behind a legacy of corruption that makes him, in the end, an extremely incompetent leader. Rigid leadership. The leader and at least some followers. Notice that followers are referred to in every single one of these definitions, are stiff and unyielding. Although they may be competent, they are unable or unwilling to adapt to new ideas, new information, or to changing times. Now, I'm not going to get political, I'm not going to get current, I'm not going to suggest that anybody that we know is guilty of rigid leadership. Rather, I will point to this particular example. A woman by the name of Mary Meeker. Just out of curiosity, raise your hands if you know who Mary Meeker is. Oh, maybe 25% of the audience. Mary Meeker was what I call an opinion leader. That is, she did not hold a formal position of power and authority as we usually use the term, but when she spoke, legions listened and did what she told them. What did she tell them to do? She was a financial analyst who was a stock picker. In particular, she was a stock picker during the heyday of the internet, tech stocks, particularly the 90s, the late 90s, as they went up and up and up and up. The trouble is that Mary Meeker did not see the times were changing. She stuck with her internet stocks too long, and so the woman who was known in her heyday as the queen of the net became the poster child for Can We Ever Trust Wall Street Again? The queen of the net was so rigid that she became this wanted poster, as it were, for stock advisors, financial analysts who misled legions of stock buyers as the stocks tanked. Intemperate leadership. The leader lacks self-control and is aided and abetted by followers who are unwilling or unable effectively to intervene. Once again, where do I choose my examples from? The world is full of intemperate leaders, but I could not resist but focus on this particular man. Marion Barry, Jr. It's an easy laugh, but an interesting story. Marion Barry was addicted to what I typically call sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Now, what's interesting about this story is not so much the man, because we can call an addiction an illness. So let's, for the sake of this discussion, say that Marion Barry was ill. What's interesting is that the voters of Washington, D.C., 4 times over elected him mayor. Now, the first time we can understand because it was not in evidence then, it really didn't flower until much later. Second time, harder to understand. Third time, fairly incomprehensible that he was reelected. Fourth time, absolutely incomprehensible. Thus, the tale of intemperate leadership, bad leadership. You can't get it unless you get the role of the follower. You don't get it. I included this picture of Marion Barry, which was taken just months ago, because he was just recently reelected one more time. Not, of course, to the mayoralty this time, but to the City Council of Washington, D.C. Callous leadership. The leader and at least some followers are uncaring or unkind, ignored or discounted, are the needs, wants, and wishes of most members of the group or organization, especially subordinates. All right, this is a fairly reasonable picture of a man who would, on the surface, appear to be a kind of a good CEO. The man's name is Al Dunlap, Jr. He was head of Scott Paper, and he was also head of Sunbeam. But this is a more telling picture of this particular CEO, who was so uncaring and so unkind and so mean and so nasty that he could almost be described as brutal. Brutal not only to those low down, and God knows he was brutal to them, but brutal even to his closest aides, against whom he threw such tantrums that he would literally be frothing from the mouth. You must be asking yourselves, how could a man like this rise to the top in American business? Maybe we'll get into the answers in the question period, but let me suffice to conclude with this particular gentleman by showing you this picture of him. It's the third in the series. What's interesting about this picture is that it's the one he himself chose to put on the cover of his autobiography. He loved being called Chainsaw Al. He loved being called Rambo in pinstripes. And this is the picture of himself that he wanted to be most known. He is, of course, wearing a black bandana on his head. He is holding a large handgun in each of both hands, and across his chest in both directions are leather straps filled with bullets. Charming. Corrupt leadership. Boring, boring, boring. So obvious, so common, so typical of so much we read. The leader and at least some followers lie, cheat, and steal. To a degree that exceeds the norm, they put self-interest ahead of the public interest. You'll notice how cautiously I phrase this, to a degree that exceeds the norm, because I assume most people put self-interest ahead of the public interest. Sometimes corruption is especially painful to witness, and this particular man is a case in point. It is William Arimony. Show of hands, how many of you know who William Arimony is? Yes. William Arimony, it pains because he was head not of a large organization typical in the private sector, but head of the nation's best known and arguably largest charity, the United Way of America. So when he stole from the organization, he stole from the coffers of the needy and the sick and the poor to whom he was supposed to be giving. Interesting story. If we had time, we would tell tales. Insular leadership. Well, this one is slightly counterintuitive, so bear with me. The leader and at least some followers minimize or disregard the health and welfare of the other, that is, of those outside the group or organization for which they are directly responsible. Now, before I take you to the next slide, I beg those of you who are Democrats not to stalk out, not to throw things at me, but to just be patient and let me explain. Bill Clinton is my example of an insular leader, but before I get to the reason why, let me explain a little bit more about insular leadership. To me, insular leadership is leadership, again, that is so focused on those within the group or organization that it ignores the common good or the general welfare. For example, in the book I include short stories about a man named Lee Raymond, head of Exxon Oil, who cares an awful lot about ExxonMobil, about the oil industry, but precious little for the environment. I include stories about leaders in the cigarette industry who cared a lot about selling a lot of cigarettes, but withheld information about how cigarettes can be harmful to your health. So you're thinking, well, okay, how does Bill Clinton fit into this picture? Remember, I use the word leadership. I do not use the word leader. I am not calling Bill Clinton an insular leader, but I would argue that this man was responsible for an incident of insular leadership which is egregious. And probably some of you in the room already know whereof I speak. It is the case of Rwanda. It happens that the Rwandan genocide, which happened in 1994, while Bill Clinton, of course, was president, was arguably one of the worst genocides in human history simply because it was stunningly efficient. 800,000 people killed in 4 months' time. That's a lot of killing, right fast. Now, you may be saying to yourselves, well, what has Bill Clinton got to do with what happened in Africa? Well, it's a good question, and I can't answer it directly, except to remind each and every one of us that the American president bears a lot of responsibility for what goes on in the world, for better and worse. At that time, the Secretary General of the United Nations was Boutros Ghali. He did no better than Bill Clinton. Kofi Annan was in a high position at the United Nations. He did no better than the other two that I've mentioned, nor did any of the other leaders. But this subject, that is Rwanda, did come up during the Clinton administration. Neither Warren Christopher nor Madeleine Albright nor any of them really wanted to do anything about it. Some people in the State Department did, but they were told to be quiet and to go away. 4 years later, Bill Clinton did apologize. The international community, together with nations in Africa, must bear its share of responsibility for this tragedy as well. We did not act quickly enough after the killings began. We should not have allowed the refugee camps to become safe havens for the killers. We did not immediately call these crimes by their rightful names, genocide. Now, that is an apology, but I bet some of you can figure out what my problem with this apology is. It's the word we. It's the word we. It's what ethicists call the problem of many hands. If the responsibility is collective, it's not individual. When we make a mistake and we really want to assume responsibility for that mistake, it's important that we say, I bear responsibility. Finally, evil leadership. It's amazing how common evil leadership is, even when defined as I do, very, very narrowly, with a very high bar for evil. Evil leadership, the leader and at least some followers commit atrocities. Again, the followers are key. They use pain as an instrument of power. The harm done to men, women, and children is severe rather than slight. The harm can be physical or psychological, or the harm can be both. I wish I could say I had a paucity of examples from which to choose. This small sampling suggests that I did not. As we sit here comfortably tonight, the world is full of evil leaders and followers who do their bidding. The example I chose to focus on is this particular man. He was the leader of the Bosnian Serbs during the war in the Balkans. Radovan Karadzic is his name. And he's a particularly interesting case in point because he was not a leader for very long. He's not one of those people to whom I can point, see, he was in power too long, power corrupted. No, he was not, because he had another line of work. He had another line of work. He was a physician. He was a psychiatrist, is a psychiatrist, and interestingly also a published poet, a successful poet. This physician and poet morphed in no time flat, by all accounts, into an evil leader. He is charged with crimes against humanity. As we sit here, however, instead of being brought to trial, this is the picture. The picture, as you see before you, is of a man sitting comfortably on a couch with a baby on his lap. The baby is his grandson, Karadzic's grandson. And unfortunately, it suggests the obvious. The picture was taken just a few years ago. That is, well after these crimes were committed, well after he had been indicted for crimes against humanity by the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague. And still, we say we can't find him. Now, I say we say because the issue of finding criminals is a hot topic, has been a hot topic ever since 9/11. We're looking for Osama. We're looking for Osama. We can't find him. We can't find him. We can't find him. This is an example of a man who, by all accounts, could be found. NATO hasn't found him. He's hiding. We more or less know where he's hiding, and we more or less know who's protecting him. And yet, for whatever constellation of reasons, not the Americans, not the Europeans, not the NATO countries have chosen to go out and get him. I end the book with recommendations, and you can go to the next slide, too. because I will not linger on these recommendations. Please note, though, that these are recommendations not necessarily only for leaders. In fact, this book is more about followers than it is about leaders. And this brings me back to the web. As I said at the start, I wrote this book as a kind of a crusade. It is my feeling that we cannot begin to stop bad leadership or even slow it unless we come to grips with it, unless we look at it and examine it. It is as if a physician would opt for health, would want to keep people healthy, but would be absolutely unwilling to look at pathology, at disease. And what you find when you look very closely here is not only followers who go along who are in close, but all of the rest of us who are, for good and sound reason, bystanders to a lot of bad leadership. We shake our heads, we cluck our tongues, but generally we do nothing. So part of my point, both of this presentation and of the book itself, is to argue that if we want to do something about bad leadership, the problem is in our laps and on our very own doorstep. Thank you very much.
Our thanks to Dr. Barbara Kellerman, Research Director at Harvard's Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School of Government and author of Bad Leadership, for her comments today. My name is Bob Soldick. I am Vice Chair of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors. I will be moderating today's audience question period, and we have quite a few questions, Barbara, so let me get right to them. First question. One of the popular programs on television these days is The Apprentice. Donald Trump, what kind of a leader is he in your opinion, and what about the leadership he's demonstrating on The Apprentice, assuming that you have watched this as part of your study?
Oh no, I'm much too intellectual ever to watch television. Okay, so I'm actually a fan of the show. How many of you in this room have watched the show? Okay, admit it. At least half of you have. It's a rather lively show, and in its first year was actually very good. And it's not even a question of what I thought about it. As some of you may know, it was shown in a lot of business schools across the country. So people were pointing to the show and saying, this is what's good and this is what's bad. Look, I don't work for the Trump Organization, and I've never studied the Trump Organization. But I'd be an idiot if I didn't say the man was doing something right. Now, we take pleasure in reading about his fiascos, and he has them, God knows. Nobody with such vaunted ambitions cannot have fiascos. I think recently his casino, the part of his whole organization that deals with casinos, ran into considerable fiscal trouble. So the man's not necessarily a genius. But is he a remarkable man, a remarkable leader? Probably. How is he a leader? He heads a huge organization which has made a lot of money, which has gotten worldwide attention. And on the show, he models a particular kind of leadership which I have to say is not entirely without charm. This man has a sense of humor, he has a sense of style, so how can anyone consider him all bad?
How about yourself? Have you, has this study made you into a cynical person? Do you see bad leadership every place you look? Have you become sort of a conspiracy theorist in this arena?
Well, I think I saw bad leadership every place I looked, even before I started writing this book, which is what made me start to write the book. Look, I am so old that I can remember the days of Hitler and Stalin. Now, I don't mean I was around when they were, starting their line of work. But I grew up in an intensely political household. And in that political household, some of the giants of history were being discussed. And as it turns out to be a giant of history, you don't have to be all good. You can sometimes be all bad. Somebody said that the history of the 20th century was written by a handful of men, and while Churchill was in that group, so was Hitler. And as a student of Russian studies, which, as was mentioned earlier, I was as a graduate student at Yale, you cannot study the Soviet Union without coming to grips with the fact that Stalin was evil beyond measure. Under his realm, far more people died than under Hitler's. And when you read about this and you study it, you say to yourself, how could this happen? It is mind-boggling that a single person, to be sure, surrounded by a coterie of followers, could wreak so much evil. And whatever you think, for example, of Bush's policy in Iraq, if you read what was written about Saddam before the invasion, before the American invasion, you again shake your head and say, how can evil like this persist and prevail? As we sit here, it's happening all over the continent of Africa. So this is not some obscure phenomenon relegated to the dustbin of history. This is our problem, and it is our wonderment that such things happen in the world, ranging from incompetence all the way to evil. So no, I would say that I'm not cynical. If anything, I believe, as I said at the start and at the end, that the more we think about this stuff and come to grips with it, the more our collective consciousness is raised, to use a term that was used in the 60s, consciousness raising, which means to get us to start to think about this stuff, the more likely it is that we will be able someday effectively to attack it. One more word, if I might, Bob. I do not understand why we Americans, why people on the planet are perfectly willing to attack collectively physical diseases. So we attack heart disease, and we attack AIDS, and we attack cancer. Why is it that we don't attack what I call this particular social disease of bad leadership? It is a social disease, and it deserves to be attacked with the same vigor that we reserve for physical diseases.
You mentioned President Bush, and we've got several questions about President Bush and his leadership style.
Which president?
Bush, the current one.
Oh.
Maybe one way to encapsulate these questions with this following question. This president seems to insist on total loyalty among his subordinates. Would you consider that, as a management expert, a warning signal?
Sure. I mean, you know, if George were sitting here in our midst, he should be, you know, we should bring him in for the conversation. I don't know of any management expert, any leadership expert who thinks it's wise. It's not the loyalty that's the problem. That's not the problem. We all want to be surrounded by loyal people in our private lives and in our professional lives. That's understandable. What's not very smart, and I think we all know this, is to surround, for any of us, by the way, this is not a leadership issue, for any of us, and particularly leaders who wield potentially great power and great authority and great influence, to surround themselves with people who do not have the courage, who do not have the guts to stand up and provide different opinions. We must have devil's advocates in our lives. So if I say, I want to take this job, I have somebody around me who says, no, you should take the other job. If the president says, I think I want to invade Iraq, we have some people in the mix who can be intensely loyal, but one way of being loyal is to offer the other side. Have you looked at this? Have you considered that? What will we do if this scenario plays out instead of that scenario? So it's one thing to quest for loyalty, It's another thing to quest for yes men and yes women.
Successful leadership seems to accrue a good deal of power. And this question says, does the power that goes with successful leadership inevitably nurture personal characteristics that ultimately lead to bad leadership, corruption, insularity, and so forth? In other words, does power and leadership form generally corrupt its owner?
Well, that would be really depressing. Well, we have sitting to our left a woman who's been the leader of the Commonwealth Club for some time. I don't know if she would consider being in a position, I particularly note your word, Bob, inevitably. No, of course, I mean, we'd all just throw in the towel and go home and watch The Apprentice instead of hanging out here. No. Do I think this is inevitable? Absolutely not. However, having said that, do I think, is it my observation from looking at a lot of cases of bad leadership that when you are in positions for a very long time, you tend to get stuck, you tend to lose objectivity, you tend to burn out, you tend to get less creative, you tend often to get greedier. Now, what does greed mean? It's interesting, the different things that greed can mean. On the surface, it means money. And we all know how, we read the paper and we go, wasn't $10 or $20 million a year enough for this particular chief executive? Did he or she, usually he, did he really need that additional 10 million in stock options or 20 million in stock options? So greed's about money, but it's also about power, particularly when you're looking at the categories of callousness. Al Dunlap, who, by the way, made unbelievable sums of money at Scott Paper and also at Sunbeam, even though he brought Sunbeam down. But it wasn't only about money. It's about power. It's about power. And if you look at evil leadership, it's absolutely not about money. It is about extending the domain of control. So the greed is for material things, money. The greed is for power. And sometimes the greed is for things like sex. If you're in a place of power for a very long time, you'd better watch it. More importantly, if you're in an organization, however that organization is defined, with someone who has been in power for a very long time, you as a follower better watch it and better try to work with other followers in case you see bad leadership emerging. Just one other comment, Bob. For those of you who are in situations where you would even think about doing something about bad leadership, let me give you one little tip. First of all, there are things we can do. This is not like the rising of the sun in the east. Bad leadership is not inevitable. So what is to be done? One little tip, which I will take just one moment to articulate. Bad leadership is far easier to cure, like the common cold, if it's caught early on. The more deeply bad leadership becomes entrenched, the more deeply beneath the surface its roots, the harder it is to uproot. So catch it early if you can.
You mentioned greed, which brings us to another question about Dennis Kozlowski, the former CEO of Tyco. In your book, you described Mr. Kozlowski as astonishingly successful, but greedy to the point of being corrupt. So it raises the question, is greed a punishable offense? Was there criminal behavior? Was he, at the end of the day, a bad leader in your terminology?
Oh, look, I think anyone, I don't even want to get into the legalities of the question, Bob, but there is a kind of common sense approach we can have to all of this. If someone is offensively greedy, if someone seems to want so much money that is so far out of our collective realm, as to make us think, what is it with this person? I mean, this was the man of the $6,000 shower curtain. Okay, raise your hands in this group. How many of you have a $6,000 shower curtain? How many? Okay, sir, I see. Okay, I take it all back. I take it all back. When we read about the excesses of Kozlowski, it was impossible not, it almost, I don't know how some of you felt, but when I read about it, you don't know whether to laugh or cry. It's so ludicrous, some of it, that you just go, what is this? So I would set aside the legal question and simply say that anyone who is so out of touch with the rank and file, who permits between him and them, that is, between himself or herself as leader and them, the followers, in this case, let's say the employees, to allow such a wide gap to happen, you'll notice there's agreement from the gods, such a wide gap to happen, that's bad leadership. Period. No matter how much money the company makes, it is offensive, it is not good for morale, it is not good for the audience at large, and stockholders, who I'm happy to say are becoming at least slightly more active about this kind of thing, as are boards, which is a whole other subject we could go into as to why boards often just go, you want another $5 million? What is that all about? Why don't boards take the leadership that they should take? Again, there are many reasons. If we have time, we can go into a few of them. But I would argue, Bob, that when the greed is excessive, yes, that's bad leadership.
Mr. Kozlowski was accused of looting about $300 or $400 million, but it's always that darn pesky shower curtain that comes up. It's interesting.
Symbols.
Please comment on executives and CEOs who are ousted from their positions and then receive huge severance packages after they leave. What can be done to prevent bad leaders from benefiting from profiting from poor leadership? It's kind of a follow-on to your previous comment.
Yeah, well, what's happening now with the Disney Corporation? That's a very nice little case in point. As we know, most of us in this room know that Michael Ovitz, for staying with Disney for, I don't know, was it a year and a month or something like that, was rewarded so handsomely that for years and years and years, people put their hands to their face in absolute horror until it happened that some shareholders in the Disney Corporation decided to sue, decided to look into this. It is outrageous when, it's a vague analog to the Karadzic example I showed you. One of the ways of how do we stop criminals, or how does the society as a whole try to stop criminal behavior? By threatening to catch people and throw them in jail if they misbehave. Now, without going into the jail syndrome here, when somebody acts badly, we do not reward them, whether they're bad because they were ineffective or bad because they were immoral. We do not reward bad behavior. We don't reward it in children. We should not reward it in adults. And as long as we keep on giving golden parachutes to executives who should be gently ushered out the door, we will continue to have bad leadership because it pays off.
You are a professor, and several questions dealt with trying to train our young people with respect to bad leadership. So how effectively are the business schools teaching students how to deal with incompetence and other characteristics of bad leadership?
Well, manifestly not effectively enough. Look, ever since Enron, business schools have thrown up their hands and said, oh my, we must do something. And the business school at Harvard is a case in point. The curriculum has been revamped, and there's now a major first-year course that looks, among other things, at ethical behavior. However, there's a sad truth to this, which is that we know, that is, educators know very, very, very little about how to train for good leadership, whether that's ethical leadership or competent leadership. For as many people who say there's got to be an ethics course in every business school curriculum, and this should be riddled throughout the curriculum, There's someone else who says that's not the way to teach people about ethics. You've got to get them when they're 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 years old. And the reason this argument takes place is because, again, as I said, we don't really know how to do it. Look, common sense would apply. It can do no harm to talk about ethics. It can do no harm to acquaint people in business schools, and I'm at a school of government, and I would say the same holds for people in schools of government, with how to behave ethically. But I don't know how you feel. I would argue that there's something that makes me slightly skeptical about the capacity of a business school professor to teach, or a professor of government for that matter, to teach a 25-year-old or a 30-year-old or a 35 or 40-year-old about how properly to behave.
In your opinion, if there was a case, maybe there is, about Chainsaw Al in a business school, would the students come away thinking that that was behavior they should emulate because it was so successful, at least for a while, or they should avoid?
No, I think there's nothing about this man anyone would want to emulate. What I would hope people would come away with when they read about him is less about him than the people around him who tolerated his misbehavior. This is yet another case that's fascinating as to his own excesses. But what's equally fascinating, how would you like to work for someone, maybe some of you do, but I bet if you do, you don't much like it, who brutalizes you, and I mean brutalizes you on a daily basis? How would you like to work for someone or be in an organization where you know that from one moment to the next you can easily be fired? So what's instructive about that case is the reflection back on us. What do we do when we are in a situation where someone behaves so badly? The argument of this book is that I hope we do something. We shouldn't just take it. We shouldn't just take it. We should do something.
Have you ever had a bad boss, a bad leader, and what did
no,
you do about
no.
it?
I've been living in utopia, and I've just never had a bad boss. That's a great question. What did I do about it? I will say about academics that they're actually, more autonomous than most other lines of work. But yes, how personal should I get here?
Oh, go ahead.
I tried to work, I think, with some degree of effectiveness behind the scenes. I did not approach this person directly. I recruited some allies who agreed with me in the organization, who saw the situation as I did, went to a few key people who I thought would be more influential with this person than I could possibly be, and things got somewhat better. Let me just say another word about this one, too. I don't want to sell you for a moment on the ease with which one upends bad leadership. It's tough. It's very hard work. Sometimes it's risky. It can be risky in different ways. It can be risky at a low level. You get marginalized. Sometimes it's risky at a high level. Your job can be threatened, and sometimes you could literally be shot. So this is not easy lifting. This is not light lifting. Upending bad leadership is heavy lifting, hard work, but doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
That darned hard work again. Are most entrepreneurs bad leaders because most entrepreneurs are self-focused, they're individualistic versus group-oriented, this questioner asks?
I think a lot of leaders are self-motivated and self-interested. The entrepreneur, it's often said that somebody who starts a business or comes up with some kind of creative idea should not be the one who runs the business. And I think entrepreneurs are creative in wonderful ways, obviously, if they're successful. But I would say that that's not very different from a leader. A leader needs to be creative and resourceful every bit as much as an entrepreneur. And I think leaders, like entrepreneurs, are interested in the self. They, some of them are narcissistic in ways that are absolutely astonishing. A lot of the leadership rhetoric, which talks about teamwork and collective participation, is just that. It's rhetoric. In the real world, leaders, most of them are very self-involved and think lots more about themselves than they do about their followers. Does that sound cynical? Maybe just a tad. I would argue, though, it's not unlike the real world.
In the real world, is bad leadership determined by the outcome or by the process underway?
Yeah, well, that's the means-ends issue that I talked about during the presentation. The answer, I think, is both. If the means are really, really bad, again, however bad is defined, that's bad leadership. And if the means are good, but the ends are bad, I mean, one of the examples I talk about in the book is the example of the Catholic Church, where arguably the ends, with this cover-up of abusiveness and so forth and so on, where the ends were arguably noble ones, that is, to protect the church, but the means used were not. I'm not sure you can divorce one from the other. I think if the means are bad, the leadership is bad. If the ends are bad, the leadership is bad.
We always hear about leaders being called unfair. Did you explore the concept of simple fairness in your book?
I think I explore it. I don't know that I use the word fair once in the book. I do talk about equity and balance. And what is fairness, after all, but striking some kind of an equitable relationship between leaders and followers, having a contract that is in the best interest of all. And in that sense, I think the book is all about fairness, although that's not a word I particularly use.
Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of this meeting. We have time for one more question, and I'd like you to think about with us whether or not things are getting better. In your conclusion to your book, you describe some of the ways things are getting better, or now I guess you're left with leave us with the question, is this just another societal problem which will ultimately be improved on through training, legislation, regulation, and so forth? Or is it like the plague of mosquitoes, which we can swat at one at a time, but somehow they're always still with us?
Look, I'm not, as I said earlier, I'm not a Pollyanna. I think we'll swat away at this forever, but that doesn't mean that I don't also, and this is probably a good note on which to end our conversation. As I looked around and thought about this, obviously a great deal, I do think there's a chance that things are getting somewhat better. Why do I say this? For example, in the private sector, the level of shareholder activism is absolutely going up. Shareholders are no longer quite so willing as they once were simply to say okay to whatever management decides. In the public sector, I'm in the state of California right now. I don't know if you consider the recall of Gray Davis a sign of citizens being unwilling to tolerate bad leadership. Whatever one thinks of that particular situation, it was an example of citizen motivation, citizens getting it together to turn away someone in whom they no longer believed. And with regard also to war crimes tribunals, while I pointed to the case of Radovan Karadzic, The Hague is more active than it has ever been before in its history in terms of trying to get some of these people. So I think there is some slight movement in a positive direction. It's not a magic bullet, but as I said, as part of my presentation, I am hoping that one part of this work of combating this social disease is to raise the consciousness of a group like this one who thinks hard about these things and possibly and hopefully also in creative ways to stop or at least slow bad leadership.
Our thanks to Dr. Barbara Kellerman, Research Director at Harvard's Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School of Government and the author of Bad Leadership, for joining us. We also thank our audiences here as well as on radio and television. And now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, commemorating its 101st year of enlightened discussion, is adjourned.